I'm also super proud to introduce tonight's moderator, TANAИS. Yeah. TANAIS is a portmanteau of Tanwi Nandini Islam, a renaming of self free of patriarchy. She is the author of Bright Lines, which we have for sale in the back. It was a finalist for the Center for Fiction First Novel Prize. She's the founder of High Wildflower Botanica, a small batch niche perfume, candle, and skincare line. Her writing has appeared in Elle.com, Fashionista.com, Open City, which is another project of the workshop. It's our journalism site. Women 2.0, Billboard.com, and Gawker. A graduate of Brooklyn College, MFA, and Vassar College. She lives in Brooklyn, and we're super, super lucky to have her as our moderator tonight. Give her a big round of applause.
Obstacles. Hello, I'm Thani. I'm going to introduce Mira T Lee. A little bit about Mira. Her debut novel, Everything Here is Beautiful, was selected as an Indies Introduced Title Top 10 debut for 2018, an Indie Next pick by the American Booksellers Association, and named a top winter 2018 pick by more than 30 news outlets, including the Wall Street Journal, New York Magazine, and more. Her short fiction has appeared in journals such as the Southern Review and American Short Fiction, and she's twice received a special mention for the Pushcart Prize. She currently lives with her husband and 2 young sons in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Please welcome Mira T Lee.
Thank you so much to AAWW for having me here. I've heard so much about this organization, and I've utilized all these resources on your website, and I've read your interviews for so long and never been to this space, and actually never met in person anybody who's associated with this organization. So I feel very fortunate in having utilized the things that you provide to the community, but yet not having met you. So I'm so happy to be able to be here and give something back, you know. So, you know what, it's fine. Just a little. Oh, thanks. Short. Thanks. So my debut novel came out in January after 2 long years of being in the pre-pub process, and so it's just nice to have it out into the world. And as a writer, what I've always been drawn to is questions that have no right or wrong answers. And so I've always been interested in moral gray areas, and particularly situations where there are conflicts between people who love each other, but who are also hurting each other, and yet no one's at fault. And so it was a series of these kinds of predicaments that I wanted to explore in this novel. So questions like, what happens when you're married to one person but find yourself in love with another? Or what happens when what you want for yourself isn't in the best interests of your child? Or what happens when someone you love is in dire straits but refuses to get help? Do you insist, and how? And at what point do you have to step back and just let them crash and burn? And then what happens if they're also hurting other people you love? Then who is your allegiance to, and what can you do? And so what resulted was this very messy family drama about 2 sisters and how their lifelong bond is put to the test as the younger Lucia struggles with a mental illness, and her sister Miranda is forced to try to figure out for herself how much she's willing to sacrifice in order to help Lucia live her life. And so the story is told from multiple points of view. I was interested in exploring these dilemmas from a 360-degree perspective, but I'm going to just read from the beginning. And this is Miranda, the older sister's chapter. And this is an adapted excerpt in that it's not like a straight through passage. I tried to cut out the stuff that was like description and not very not as interesting for a reading. So I'm hoping this is the juicy parts for you. Okay. So. Miranda. Lucia said she was going to marry a one-armed Russian Jew. It came as a shock, this news, as I had met him only once before, briefly, when I was in town for a meeting with a pair of squat but handsome attorneys. His name was Yona. He owned a health food store in the East Village, down the street from a tattoo parlor, across from City Video, next door to a Polish diner, down the street from beneath 3 floors of apartments that Lucia said he rented out to the yuppies who would soon take over the neighborhood. He had offered me tea, and I took peppermint green, and he scurried around, mashing Swiss chard and kale in a loud industrial blender, barking orders to his nephews. Or maybe there were second or third cousins. I never knew. There were so many. Because they were sluggish in their work of unloading organic produce off the delivery trucks. He yelled often. I thought, this Yona is quite a rough man. He dusted the wine, mopped the floor, restocked packages of dried figs and goji berries, and ginseng snacks on the shelves. He was industrious, I could see, intent on making his fortune, as immigrants do. Lucia said he played chess. I'd never known my sister to play chess, though she was always excellent at puzzles as a child. Yona didn't seem to me the kind to play chess either, nor to drink sulfite-free organic wine or eat goji berries. But as they say, love is strange, and I wouldn't begrudge my sister love, nor any stranger, not even one who smoked, and was the kind of man who looked disheveled, even fresh after a shower, and would leave his camo briefs lying around on the bathroom floor. I admit, I was disturbed, creeped out, by his prosthetic arm, which he wore sometimes, though more often I'd find it sitting by itself in a chair. Lucia brought him to visit our mother, who was dying. Our mother was tilted back in a green suede recliner, wrapped in cotton blankets. She took a long look at this man, his workingman's shoulders, his dark stubbled jaw, his wide, flat nose. Her yoni had the essence of a duck, Lucia said, endearingly, or maybe a platypus, though she'd never seen one up close. My sister liked to discern people's animal and vegetable essences. In fact, she was usually right. Our mother winced as her gaze settled upon his left arm, a pale peachy shade that did not match the rest of him. What happened to your arm? She said. An accident when I was 21. He said it quietly, but without any shame. In Soviet Union? In Israel. I moved there when I was a teenager. You are divorced, she said. And I tried to read his thoughts in the fluttering of his blue-gray eyes. I wondered if Lucia had warned him that our mother was like that. I wondered what had been shared, what omitted, when the two of them exchanged stories over chess, over wine. I wished to say to this man, do you really think you now know our Lucia? 13 years, he said. I have been divorced for 13 years. Our mother winced again, though it could have been from the pain shooting through her bowels, or her bones, or her chest. Why are you divorced? She asked. We were married too young, he said. The skin of his face seemed to hang off his cheekbones. A basset hound, I later said to Lucia. This is life, he said to her mother. She did not seem quite satisfied with his answer, though she nodded, expelled a heavy sigh. Take care of my daughter, she said. But she was not looking at him. She was looking at me. She fell asleep. 2 weeks later, she was gone. They married quickly in City Hall. Lucia wore a sparkly tank top with pink bicycle pants, silver hoop earrings. She beamed like a bride. Yona welcomed me to their home. It was cramped, a 2-room apartment adjacent to the kitchen of the health food store. It smelled like cigarettes. In the living room, a twin mattress was laid out on the floor. It served as a bed for Yona's visiting nieces and nephews, or cousins or uncles, whoever was passing through. Lucia loved the bustle, the chaotic feel of the place. The organic kibbutz, she called it. And now, it was her home, too. Do you believe in happily ever after? she asked me that day as we sipped peppermint tea from our paper cups. I recalled the stone-faced art professor I'd recently dated for 6 weeks, felt a slight, involuntary jerk of my brow. Slight, but noticed, because Lucia noticed these kinds of things. "Oh, Gia," she sighed, "you could at least try to believe." She reached over to hug me, patted my head, like she used to as a child. That night, I lay on the twin mattress and listened to the sounds of the two of them, panting and moaning, gooey and fucking like rabbits. My sister was officially a newlywed, a wife. It came to me suddenly, as a blunt ache inside. I'd never felt more alone. I cannot say I particularly liked the way my sister behaved around her new husband, or how he'd speak to her often as though she were a child. "Lucy Goosey," he said. She'd hated that nickname all her life. "I made you your favorite food in all the world. Shakshuka." Shakshuka? Lucia loved our mother's spare ribs. Yes, those tender pork spare ribs, marinated overnight in honey and garlic and 5-spice powder. "I love you, Lucy Goosey," he said, scooping runny egg and tomato into her mouth. He kept kosher. Our mother would have been disappointed. She would not have trusted a grown man who was coarse like a rhino, but who ate like a bird. He came on vacation with us that first summer. Lucia and I liked to rent a cottage on Cape Cod with a few of our friends. I invited my old college roommate, Tess, who came from the city with her new boyfriend, the two of them all gushing and googly-eyed. Yonan invited his uncle Leo, who lived upstairs and kept the books at the store. "Avocado," whispered Lucia, and I recognized him instantly when I drove to fetch him from the bus station. Uncle Leo was short and stocky, wide at the bottom instead of up top, and wore round, rimless glasses and a yarmulke that covered most of his hair. He had unfortunately fat feet, I recall. That evening, they grilled pounds and pounds of kosher chicken breast and potatoes. "Kosher chicken is the best chicken," said Yona. "Lots of paprika," said Uncle Leo. And we all murmured that it was indeed very good and very well spiced. After dinner, they entertained our friends, smoking late into the night. I coughed in my bed. Through the buzzing of mosquitoes, I could hear Yona telling stories of childhood in Moscow, eating stale bread and goulash, cold beet soup. They spoke, too, of Israel, their days in the Israeli army. "Do you remember the tents?" said Uncle Leo. In the desert dark, it was cold. They were allowed their own pillows, and as homesick boys, they squeezed them tight, as if to wring out their fear. They joked about Passover, about the matzah heavy in their bellies that kept them awake and constipated all night. That night, I learned Yona had trained as a marksman, that he'd lost his arm when he tried to remove a Palestinian boy's body from the path of an IDF tank. In the morning, I sat on the front porch in my Adirondack chair, reading a book, while he and Lucia panted and groaned upstairs. I wished to be glad for their happiness. One day in the fall, he called. He never called. It was Lucia who called, usually once every week, to tell me about the poetry slam in the cafe where they'd served sulfite-free organic wine, or what they'd done for Rosh Hashanah, or the shakshuka she'd cooked for all the workers in the store, 3 cartons of eggs. And Yona would yell from the background in his sing-song voice, "Gia, come visit us soon." Or, "Me and Lucy Goosey, we miss you. Everything here is beautiful." This time, he whispered. "Listen," he said. "Something is happening." His rough voice wavered. "Lucia, she stopped sleeping and she's laughing and laughing in the shower all night. This morning, she's crying. She's telling me I am filming her on the security screens. Bad people are making movies of her in our room." I was in the middle of preparing a chocolate souffle, having been invited by a bungee-jumping financial analyst to his apartment for a 3rd date. I turned off the oven, boarded the next train to New York, withholding fat tears I hoped our mother could not see from her grave. "She needs a doctor," I said. "I hate doctors," said Yona. She needs a doctor, I said. This is how Lucia looked. Empty, pale, limp, like old celery. Why is this happening? He said. It had happened once before, 3 years earlier, not long after she'd finished journalism school. One doctor I'd spoken with explained that such episodes could be triggered by stress, or drugs, or trauma, or exhaustion, or sometimes nothing at all. Can't you do something? I said. No, said the doctor. What do you mean, no? I said. No, simply no. Not unless her condition worsened significantly, such that she posed an imminent risk of harm to herself or others. Until then, no, we could not help her if she did not wish to be helped. All we could do was wait. She lost her first job with a newspaper in Connecticut. Worked as a coat check girl in a trendy Manhattan bar, lost that job too. For a while, she came to stay with me in Providence, slept on a pull-out couch in the living room. One minute, she babbled on about serpents and spies. The next, she felt mute, like a shadow. When we hung out with friends, her tangential interjections turned every gathering tense. One weekend, Tess came to visit, and we went out to a club to see one of our favorite bands. How do you like living here? Tess asked. I live on Earth, hello, and it's getting polluted, said Lucia. Don't bother to breathe the air. Oh, pollution is bad, said Tess, but Providence must be better than New York. They must be living in a recession, said Lucia, or regression. I could see Tess blink. It's just math. It's not like everyone there's a genius. Have you heard the new Dave Matthews album? I asked Tess, trying to deflect attention. And we exchanged opinions until our voices trailed off, and Lucia murmured, Matthew is a liar. He's always been a liar. He's just lying all the time until he wakes up. Tess glanced at me, alarmed. Is she okay? Everyone whispered. No, I said. It was all I could say. She hardly ate, rarely bathed. But in the mornings, she marched out carrying her reporter's notebook, and in the evenings, she returned. One day, she said she wanted to move back to New York. I don't think that's a good idea, I said. But by evening, she was already gone. Thank you.
All right. So I'm very excited to introduce our next reader. Akwaeke Emezi is an Igbo and Tamil writer and artist based in liminal spaces. Born and raised in Nigeria, they received an MPA from New York University. Their debut autobiographical novel, Freshwater, Grove Atlantic, February 2018, is a New York Times Book Review Editor's Choice and Indie's introduced title. It received rave reviews from the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the New Yorker, and the LA Times, among others. Emezi's first young adult novel, Pet, will be published in 2019 by Make Me a World. They are currently making video art and working on their fourth novel. And I'm about to take that energy and put it on myself because that's amazing, fourth novel. Congratulations on that. But I'm very pleased to introduce Akwaeke, so give them a round of applause.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out. Let's see if I can. That's nice. I'm so glad to be here this evening, and I'm going to read a little bit from Freshwater. The main character is, I think the best way to describe her is that she's a plural individual and a singular collective. So the book is narrated by her plural self at first, and then later by one of her selves that precipitates out of that plural self, and in a couple of places by her. So I wanted to read a little bit from each section, so you could, for those who haven't read it, so you can kind of get a feel of the different voices. The first section is from the plural self, and this is when she's a baby. We stayed asleep, but with our eyes open, still latched onto her body and her voice as she grew in those first slow years where nothing and everything happens. She was moody, bright, a heaving sun, violent. She screamed a lot. She was chubby and beautiful and insane if anyone had known enough to see it. They said she followed her father's side, the grandmother who was dead, for her dark skin and her thick hair. Saul did not name her after his mother, though, as perhaps another man would have. People were known to return in renovated bodies. It happens all the time. Namdi, Nenna. But when he looked into the wet blackness of her eyes, he, surprisingly for a blind man, a modern man, did not make that mistake. Somehow, Saul knew that whatever looked back out of his child was not his mother, but something, someone else. Everyone pressed into the air around her, pinching her cheeks and the fatty tissue layered underneath, pulled in by what they thought was her when it was really us. Even asleep, there are things we cannot help, like pulling humans to us. They pull us too, but one at a time. We are selective like that. Sachi watched the visitors flock around the baby, concern sprouting in her like a green shoot. This was all new. Chima had been so quiet, so peaceful, cool to Sachi's heat. Disturbed, she looked for a potu and found one, a dark circle of velvet black, a portable third eye, and she affixed it to the baby's forehead, on that smooth expanse of brand new skin, a sun to repel the evil eye and thwart the intentions of wicked people who could coo at a child then curse it under their breath. She was always a practical woman, Sachi. The odds were good that the child would live. At least, the gods had chosen responsible humans, humans who loved her fiercely, since those first few years are when you are most likely to lose them. Still, it does not make up for what happened with the gates. The human father Saul had missed a birth. We never paid him much attention when we were free. He was not interesting to us. He held no vessels or universes in his body. He was off buying crates of soft drinks for the guests while his wife fought us for different liberations. Saul was always that type of man, invested in status and image and social capital, human things. But he allowed her name, and it was later, when we were awake, that we knew that and understood at last why he'd been chosen. Many things start with a name. After the boy Chema was born, Saul had asked for a daughter, so once our body arrived, he gave it a second name that meant God answered. He meant gods answered. He meant that he called us and we answered. He didn't know what he meant. Humans often pray and forget what their mouths can do. Forget that every ear is listening, that when you direct your longing to the gods, they can take that personally. Boop, boop, boop. This next section is narrated by Ada herself. I don't even have the mouth to tell this story. I'm so tired most of the time. Besides, whatever they will say will be the truest version of it, since they are the truest version of me. It's a strange thing to say, I know, considering that they made me mad. But I am not entirely opposed to madness, not when it comes with this kind of clarity. The world in my head has been far more real than the one outside. Maybe that's the exact definition of madness, come to think of it. It's all a secret I've had to keep, but no longer, not since you're reading this. And it should all make sense. I didn't want to be alone, so I chose them. In many ways, you see, I am not even real. When they speak so contemptuously of humans, I'm never sure if they mean me as well. Sometimes I wonder if there even is a me without them. They talk about Ewan, the man I married, as if he was nothing because he was only flesh. But I loved him, and that made him more than human to me. Love is transformative in that way. Like small gods, it can bring out the prophet in you. You find yourself selling dreams of spectacular hereafters, possible only if you believe, if you really, really believe. So in loving Ewan, he somehow became a god. I don't mean that in a good way. He made me suffer, but I still cast idols in his name, as people have done for their gods for millennia. It didn't end there. When the years accumulated and exposed Ewan's cracks, I covered them in gold and bronze. That's what you do for the idols you make. But I loved him, I really did. And he loved me, and that was the danger. Is there any story of a human loving a god that ends well? I was so busy pretending I was normal back then, I didn't know enough to think of that. So maybe he made me suffer. But how much can flesh really hurt spirit? Who do you think will be bruised more in the end? You see, you've gone and caught me. I'm talking as if I'm them. It's all right. In many ways, I am not even real. I am not even here. And this last section is narrated by one of the Selves, whose name is Asudara. You used to smile, Sachi said. You were such a happy child. Why are you not eating? This was actually true, but the not eating was just an experiment I was doing to see how close to the bone I could get Ada down to. She had started restricting by herself before I showed up. Probably for some human reason, trying to control her body since she couldn't control her mind. It's not important. The point is, once I was there, I took her to new weightless places, 118 pounds. She ran every day for an hour. I had her eat only salads. Hunger grabbed her from the inside intimately. It felt like it had a purpose, like it was doing something. Ada lifted dumbbells and continued running. One day, just like that, she dropped down to 114 pounds of human flesh. Let me tell you, I've never almost flown that well since. Ada's shoulders became knives in her back, and her legs looked even longer than when she took ballet in her first semester and the instructor told her that she'd need extra large tights because her legs were that long. But yes, no, she wasn't eating. It wasn't important anymore, what happened to her body, not since I was there. I appreciated it, of course. Embodiment was luxurious, at least at first. I felt a new power, a flood of greatness that, yes, Ada would regret later, valid. But for now, it was good, rich. It meant that I was an I, like I wasn't going back to that larger we. How can? No, I was free. I had elevated, transcended, in fact. Risen like steam until it was me standing in the field of Ada's body. She named me this name, Asugara, complete with that gritty slide of the throat halfway through. I hope it scrapes your mouth bloody to say it. When you name something, it comes into existence. Did you know that? There is strength there, bone-white power injected in a rush like a trembling drug. Wait, is this how humans feel? To know that you are separate and special, to be individual and distinct, it's amazing. But I had to remind myself that I wasn't human or flesh. I was just a self, a little beast, if you like, locked inside Ada. Still, it was nice to be able to move her body and feel things. When I came in front, I moved like those masquerades from her childhood, with meat layered in front of my spirit face. All I'm saying is, it was good to walk in the world. I never forgot Virginia, or the boy Soren, the place and person who midwifed me here. I also didn't forget that Ada was Allah's child. It would be too careless to forget something like that. If you are a python's child, then you are also a python. Simple. There should have been a regular molting that came with that, but I was not regular. I wasn't allowed some gentle and slow shrugging off of skin. No, my own was to tear it away as soon as I came through, splitting it into pieces that were never found, coming out damp with blood. This is what happens when you act as if a human can hold God matter without it curdling. Ada loved me, Sha. She loved me because I hated that boy. She loved me because I was reckless. I had no conscience, no sympathy, no pity. She loved me because I was strong and I held her together. I loved her because I had known her since I was nothing, since I was everything, since that shell blue house in Umuahia. I loved her because I watched her grow up, because she gave offerings since I started awakening, feeding me from the crook of her arm and the skin of her thighs. Let me tell you now, I loved her because in the moment of her devastation, the moment she lost her mind, that girl reached for me so hard that she went completely mad. And I loved her because when I flooded through, she spread herself open and took me in without hesitation. Bawling and broken, she absorbed me fiercely all the way. She denied me nothing. I loved her because she gave me a name.
I'm so excited to talk about these books. So I guess part of the thing that I really think about reading both of these books is that these, kind of characters who are struggling with their mental health, I'm going to do air quotes on that because I hate the phrase for these kind of complexities that you're describing, but they're struggling with their mental health, and I really kept feeling this sense of there is a spiritual occupation of their consciousness, and it's completely allowing them to live in a way that is a reality of their own that is in conflict with the reality of the world around them. And it's kind of like, from the outside, it seems like a curse, but from the inside, there's this pure freedom that can exist. Not always a benevolent freedom, especially in Akwaeke's. So I just love for both of you to talk about how did you kind of negotiate that feeling of this internal reality of the character who's being occupied, and the external reality of the world that they are living in, their physical, material reality.
I think in the case of Freshwater, the base premise is that everyone's occupied by spirits. In Ada's case, it just happens to be a plural spirit. And one of the reasons why I had written the book is that in the beginning, when I was still working on it, I was really nervous about writing it. I was really nervous about stepping into this spiritual reality and centering a whole work there and whether that would ever get published in this current dystopia. But I went back home and I talked to a bunch of people about the concept of the book, and what I discovered was that there were so many people who had these internal realities already that were different, that were based in indigenous spiritualities, quite frankly. And they couldn't talk about them because you're only given two options, really, both of which are pathological. You're mentally ill, or you're possessed by a demon and you need to be exorcised. And that's it. And so given the costs of dealing with either of those, people just kind of locked it inside themselves and didn't talk about it because they didn't want to sound crazy, or they didn't want to be dragged to church for deliverance, which is valid. And so when I talked to these people, I was like, oh, it's not just me. There's actually a need for these narratives that are grounded in our own realities, not in a Western one, not in something that was like forced upon us, but grounded in these realities that gives people ways of being that aren't like pathological, that don't harm them. And so I think for me, that affirmation that there were other people who also had internal realities that couldn't exist in the outside one, because the outside one is very specifically hostile to realities like that.
Yeah, it reifies that you're crazy. There's something wrong with you. You need to be put away. Like,
yeah, exactly.
committed.
And like that's like
Yeah.
that's a real fear, is that you're going to be committed. Or even for people who, like, I have a friend back home in Nigeria who, if she practices a traditional religion, she could lose custody of her child and there's nothing she can do about it. And we often think about marginalization in terms of like, okay, like skin color or, other things, but there's a thing about marginalized realities that's happening, and they're so marginalized that they're not even considered real in the first place. And so we're not talking about what is it like to have so many people who are living with these internal realities, who feel like they can't talk about them, who are then isolated and depressed and suicidal and dying because of it. And that just is a thing that is somewhere floating away into nowhere.
Totally glossed over. Mira?
So my protagonist, Lucia, is diagnosed with a mental illness that involves psychosis, which is these delusions that she has that, there are beings inside her, a little bit similar. And what I was interested in exploring is the way that her reality butts up against the realities of her responsibilities as a family member, as a wife, as a mother to a young child. And so, as I mentioned when I spoke, like, I'm interested in these questions that have no right or wrong answers. And so for her, it was like, does she go with, these feelings? She has these bouts of mania sometimes that are thrilling to her, but then eventually kind of bring her down to a place where she can't function. And so the question is, what is her responsibility to herself, and what is her responsibility to the people around her in terms of how she deals with that? So that's the question that I was interested in exploring in my novel.
I think it's kind of an interesting thing to think about, the word benevolence, almost. Like, in reading both of them, I felt so liberated in there's so much trauma that you experience when you're being, externally attacked by another person, which your book goes into, Akwaeke, and also just being completely misunderstood in Mira's book. But I thought there was this idea of these, the spiritual plurality, if you will. I like how you said that. Is it benevolent or is it malevolent, or does that not matter? Because I kept kind of siding with different people in the situation. Like, I was reading and I was like, I'm kind of on their side. And I was like, no, they're messing up her sex life. They're on their side. They're ruining her self-esteem.
I like
I'm
your
on their
priorities.
side. I kept switching it around, you know what I mean? And then sometimes you're like, oh my God, the mom, like, she's flipping out. Like, this is she's literally losing the person that she thought was her daughter. But it's like, was in, Sachi's case, was, Ada ever, her daughter? So I think that question of benevolence versus malevolence in these spirits, or however you want to kind of talk about what the person's going through. Did you have a good or bad, as you set out to write this? Did you kind of want to eliminate even thinking about them as good or bad?
Yeah, I think a couple of early reviews for Freshwater called herself evil, or called...
They just use the word evil. Okay.
I mean, to be fair, one of my favorite reviews on Goodreads was this.
You're reading those?
Oh my goodness, they're so entertaining. My God. There's a Ghanaian blogger, and now I love her because of this review, because her review was like, if I had known that this book was as sinful, dark, and blasphemous as it is, I might not have picked it up. And mind you, it was a 4 out of 5-star review. And she went on and she was like, but Freshwater is so much more than its insane level of lust and blasphemy. And I just loved it a lot. I appreciated it. It made me happy. I sent it to all my friends. But so yeah, there were people who were like, oh yeah, this is evil. And I think, at least for me in writing it, there was very much a matter of perspective. So from the perspective of spirits rather than one of flesh, like in the excerpt that I read, Esquire is very unconcerned with what happens to flesh. So for her, it's not like she doesn't think she's being malevolent, or she doesn't think she's doing anything bad. She just thinks that flesh is irrelevant. And I think that's often a narrative that we see in God-human dynamics, where they're like, oh, I'm not trying to be evil. I would have to care about you to be evil.
You have to be on my level for me to
I just think this is fun.
Esquire does consume. It feels like very consuming of flesh, though. Like, can't get enough of being filled with lust and flesh. Like, might not care, but it just comes across as very lusting. and like that sexual kind of tenor that I maybe I'm just reading really into that part because I loved how that liberated Ada from certain traumas that she's facing. I mean, how do we negotiate trauma and then this sort of light like path that these spirits allow you to take when you're dealing with trauma?
So that's a super interesting point, which goes on a little bit of a tangent about sex in the book, because a lot of people like the sections where Asura took over, and they're like, oh yeah, this is like sexy stuff. And I was slightly horrified by that.
Yeah, no, I
was
felt
like,
horrified with myself. I was just like, this is really intense.
I was like, oh, because the thing is like, it's traumatic for Ada. And so the idea that you have a self who's like doing all the like, and Asugar is completely like liberated and having the time of her life, and then Ada's kind of on the side, like she's the one who's still, and that's like they have a fight, which is I think some of my favorite scenes are where like the selves just fight with each other, and they have a fight later about the ways that Asugar uses Ada's body and then isn't there to deal with the repercussions or the consequences. And so it takes Asura a very long time to even understand that what she does has a negative effect on Ada, because the concept of like good and evil is not really like there for her. She's just like, I'm here, I'm having fun, I am, being horrible to people because justice and men are trash and they deserve it. And I don't understand why you have a problem with any of this, despite the fact I'm using your body. Seems excessive.
Conflict, to say the very least. So, Mira, I mean, I guess I talked about benevolence and malevolence, but to be more specific to your book, I loved Lucia's points of view. You do go into her point of view, and they feel so free. And you really see the difference between the sister who's like got her shit together and always doing right and has a good job and lives in Switzerland. Like literally the definition of Switzerland is like, I don't take sides, but she's like definitely trying to, sorry, I don't know if you're Swiss, but that's, in my American mind.
I did choose a Swiss husband for her for a purpose.
Yeah, just a guy who's really down to earth and like not
very
pushing
neutral,
you.
very Swiss.
He's a neutral dude, we talk about that in the book. But this kind of sister compared to Lucia, who's so free, she wants to move to Ecuador, she leaves her husband to make a baby. There's so many things, I'm sorry to give some things away, but this all is very much connected to these, I don't know if you're using the word spirits necessarily in your book, you use the word snakes. So can we talk a little bit more about that? Like how you kind of negotiated her internal, external, the benevolent and the malevolent, and how it kind of wreaks havoc on her life. Even though when you read it, you're like, you have the right ideas. Like, I want to live more free like that.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. So I think this question of where your self ends and where your illness begins is a really blurry line, especially at least in my story in Lucia's case, in that she is very free-spirited and always has been as a child, and she has this very unique way of seeing the world. She finds beauty in unexpected places. She just has a kind of quirkiness and unconventionalness, especially given that she's born into this, Chinese American immigrant family. But then there's, what happens when she kind of loses herself and falls into this illness, which is then things go wrong, like things in her life go wrong, and she ends up doing things that are detrimental to herself and to the people around her. And so I personally see it as a real struggle for her. But I do think that in her case, when she's not able to take care of her child because she believes that touching her 12 times is going to impart, this evil spirit and is going to kill her child. She basically believes that right after her child is born. Then, it starts causing real problems in her life, which the other people around her then have to come in and try to help her out and fix the situation. For example, what are you going to do with your baby if you can't take care of her? And so then the burden falls to the people who love her. And so that's really, largely what the novel, a big part of the novel is what happens when you love somebody but they can't take care of themselves, and at what point do you have to kind of step back and just let her be? But then there's this child involved, so do you have a responsibility to make sure that the mom is okay? So, yeah.
Yeah, that is a difference in terms of like negotiating your health with a child needing to be attended to. I actually wanted to kind of talk about the medical industrial complex. I don't know what we would call this, but how mental health and institutionalization of people with different disorders of the mind, however it's been kind of talked about in the Western medical system. How do you think like a character in your work, I mean, how do they brush up against this sort of violence of that system? I mean, you know, there's in, you know, Akwaeke's book, you definitely have a very real, you know, scene in terms of the medical system helping your character Ada get to a new place in their actual physical body. And in your book, this is where, you know, she gets treatment, Lucia gets help, she gets medicine, but the medicine numbs her out and makes her not feel. So there's this like negotiation between the system that's helping you, you know, but then it's like, imagine, I think it was in your book where you're like, imagine if your very nature and thread of your fabric of reality is being questioned on a fundamental level by everyone else who tells you you're wrong, but you feel just as certain as I feel that everything's okay. I mean, how do they negotiate their role, you know, in a society that kind of rejects the way that they think?
So in Freshwater, there's a part where Ada starts to try and go to therapy, and Asuga is like, over my cold, dead body, which is also yours, but whatever. And there's something there about trying to protect her and trying to protect the reality that the selves have within them, because the arguments that Asugara makes are valid, where she's like, you can't tell them about us. You know how they're going to react, you know what they're going to think, because she knows that it's going to be made into something that's wrong and broken. And at that point, Ada's already dealing with like a gazillion other things about her that she feels are wrong and broken. And so that knowledge, I think it ties back to what we were talking about earlier, where it's like the internal reality is fundamentally incompatible with the exterior one, and the selves are aware of this, and so they try very hard to control, I think, how much of that internal reality Ada like talks about. So she's allowed to go and she's allowed to talk about her depression or her suicidality, but she's not allowed to talk about the selves. She's never allowed to tell any of her therapists that she has selves. And that's kind of the compromise that they reach. That's kind of the boundary that like Asugara creates, where it's like, you can, okay, fine, you can get help for these other things, whatever, but you can't cross this line. So even whatever medical things that do happen only because all the selves agree on it. And so they have to reach kind of consensus before Ada is actually allowed to move forward, because otherwise the others will literally stop her. I don't know if that answered the question.
I had a really long question, so I don't even know. I love what you said, so that we'll leave it at that. Institutions versus the individual who's, you know, dealing with their mental health.
So in my novel, Lucia ends up in a psychiatric ward for quite a long period of time, during which she refuses medications for a while, but then eventually acquiesces. And for me, I have to say, this comes from a very, very personal place, in that I have family members who have illnesses of the nature that are in the book, so schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorder. And so I have seen my loved one, you know, go from being the person I've known for my whole life and their whole life into somebody who has an illness and who can all of a sudden, or maybe not all of a sudden, but, you know, pretty quickly not function. And so going from, you know, having a job and being able and having friends to not having a job and not being able to not even decompensating to the point that they can't even speak a coherent sentence. And so when I was living with my loved one and saw this, to me, it was very, very clearly something was wrong. This was not a part of her personality from birth, or, you know, this was not the person I'd known my whole life. And so when my loved one ended up in the hospital and did eventually find a medication that worked, I could see that my loved one was coming back, and this was the person I'd known all my life. And so for me, in my experience, is that it's very much a brain illness where something happens, and then sometimes if we find the right treatments, you know, the person can kind of be come back to who they were. So for me, it's not like Lucia was always this way and couldn't really function or functioned a certain way. It was very much that she was here and then she's here, you know, and then we have to find some way to bring her back. And so for me, I think that, you know, I understand that the medications, the mental health system is very, very harsh in the way that it deals with these illnesses and people who have these illnesses. And, you know, all the side effects and all this blunting of her personality is real, and these are real side effects, which is why people don't want to take these medications. But on the other hand, without them, you know, if you can't function, then you're not living a great life either. And so for me, you know, it's very much a balance of trying to figure out, you know, what kind of care can get your loved one back to being a functional human being.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I have a lot of things I could talk about, but does anyone in the audience want to talk about anything in our lovely audience today? Any questions? Yes. Do you need a mic? Oh, we have a mic? All right. Great.
This is not really a question, but I really like what you all were saying about, say it in my own terms, like bringing sensuality to the experience of mental health. I saw it sort of coming through all the texts in some way or another, and I just really appreciate that, because I feel like so much of the way that mental health experiences are interpreted is like a severed head, that it's all with the mind, and that these experiences were really embodied, was so meaningful and so real and so urgently needed to be represented that way. So I'm just grateful for that. And I guess my question out of that would be, what was it like to write into the body that way when you're writing about the mind?
I like that question.
You go first,
So let me get this right. So what is it like to write into that kind of mind state? Is that what
The
you're?
sensuality of, so like I think what you're, can I assist? I think that part of, and I noticed this too, so I definitely see what you're saying, but it's like in this experience of, you know, what you're describing in both of you describe in your novels, I mean, it is still very much connected to the body and experiencing the senses and sexuality and passion and all these things. It's not like this disaffected, disordered mind. And it's not the separation between mind and the lusting body. You know, it's like, just because your brain isn't, you know, in the place that it was, or, you know, it doesn't mean you can't still feel every experience on a deep cellular level or whatever. So I think both of you did a great job kind of showing that. So you're asking, how was it experience? Yeah? Okay, cool.
Yeah, I think that it's, so these episodes are very much all about perception. In fact, I think it's about the way that perception is changed. And I think that also includes not only kind of mental perception things, but even how things feel, like how physically things feel. And so I think probably you can speak more to, you know, the kind of physical embodiment of these kinds of, you know.
Well, I think for Lucia, it seems like when she's escaping and traveling and being free away from her responsibility of her day-to-day regular life, it does come through
I think that's
in
just
a-
part of her personality.
Yeah.
That's just, that's part of who she is and how she, what she was born with. I don't think that has to, well, it's a question, like how much of that predisposes her to to this illness that then takes her down.
Where does the wanderlust begin? Like, where does it end? I mean, it's
Right.
kind of this infinite
Right.
loop.
Right.
Yeah.
But I think that, her kind of sensualness and her way of, seeing beauty is very much just who she is, just kind of.
Yeah, I think embodiment is inevitable in whatever is being experienced. So for me, the idea of the mind even being, like, that may be how it's talked about, like the mind being separate from the body, but I'm like, but that's not how it happens. So, so there wasn't really any other way to write it, because it's still happening in the body. Like, no matter what episodes are happening, no matter what, it's still happening inside a body. It's still happening to a body. It's still experienced in that way. Even the experience of dissociations is being experienced by a body. So I think for me that there was never a mind-body split. There was no way that those two could be separated.
Of course, yeah. Anyone else? Yeah.
Thank you both so much for your reading. And I'm really glad that sorry, is it back? I'm really glad that both of you read and talked about these slightly different perspectives, but also, on the same topic, because personally, as someone with anxiety and obsessive compulsive disorder, I've gone to different events where, like, there's one person who says that, like, they wish their reality were understood as, like, that their alternative reality could be understood as, like, a legitimate reality. Whereas for me, like, I never wish that. Like, it's just so painful to have that anxiety. I don't want to believe that that this reality is real. So I appreciate that, like, I feel like mental illness, if you want to call that, or having different realities, it's like experienced differently by different people. And so I guess I wanted to ask you both, like, if you, like, from writing this and from sharing these stories, like, have your conversations with people, do you feel like you're impacting the discussion in a certain way? Like, do you feel like your conversations with people about your books are, like, what's come out of those discussions in the discussions after publication for you both? Thank you.
I think for me it's been, two things. In talking about the book, or in talking about the character, I prefer to think of it as neurodivergence instead of mental illness, which is a term that was created by the autistic community, because it's not pathological. It just means your brain works differently. That's it. It's a neutral term. So for me, my character is, like, there's mental illness is not really relevant. It's like, oh, this is a neurodivergent character. It shows up in certain ways, and shifting that viewpoint to being like, oh, people's brains are different. Some of it is harder to cope, and a lot of the time, the thing that makes it harder to cope with is how everyone reacts. Like, I've been in 3 different grad schools with, like, severe depression and severe anxiety, and what I've learned from that is that a lot of the time, what makes the anxiety, at least for me, like, so painful is the fact that it's not accommodated, is the fact that the world thinks that there's something wrong. And so what I've had to do as a result is create a world that only includes people that accommodate it. Because it's so much better if you're just like, oh, I can't do this because of anxiety. And people are like, cool, totally get it. Or like, I don't have spoons to do this thing. I'm in negative spoons right now. Spoon theory is a thing that is about the art. Google it. It's gonna be too long to explain. But so this idea that there's nothing wrong with having there's nothing wrong with being neurodivergent. There's nothing wrong with having a brain that functions differently. It's just that we live in a society that really treats neurodivergent people like crap. And it would have been so much different for me if I was raised in a family, in a world, in a reality where that wasn't a problem that had to be fixed, where I wasn't too sensitive, or I wasn't crying for no reason all the time, or like all these things. If society had been a place where it was like, okay, she's clearly overwhelmed by this, let's not make her do it. And so that's one of the things where it's like, that's part of the conversation, is this idea of neurodivergence instead of mental illness. This idea that a lot of what's wrong is not the individual or their brain. People just have different brains. Sometimes some are going to need help, some are going to need medication. The problem is how society treats it. And the secondary thing was that realities are not mutually exclusive. So one of the conversations that happened a lot after Freshwater came out was that people would be like, oh, this is a book about mental illness. And I was like, no, it's not. This is a book about embodiment. The main character is neurodivergent, yes, because she's an embodied spirit. Like, that is her particular problem. That is the root of all, like, that's the root of things. That's what's causing all of these. And they manifest as neurodivergence in this world. And there are techniques and strategies and therapies that are useful to manage that. And I think whenever I would say, oh, it's not a book about mental illness, people would read it as me being like, mental illness isn't a thing, or like, it's not that, or like, oh, if you're neurodivergent, then it must be a spiritual thing. And it's like, why does one reality have to cancel out? Like, why do people, I know why, but, but there's this thing where I'm like, it doesn't have to be either or. It can be that this person has a spiritual dissonance happening that is manifesting as neurodivergence and can still benefit from mental health therapies. These two things don't have to be competing with each other.
Yes, I love that. Yeah. You wrote all that down, right? Mira, did you want to respond to that question?
Yeah, so for me, I come from it from a very different perspective. I am in a lot of groups with other family members who have loved ones with mental illnesses like schizophrenia, and I hear about their stories like every single day. And I hear about how a mother's son, you know, who's now 18, has suddenly locked himself in his room and won't come out, and you know, has become severely paranoid, and how he's become very aggressive or even physically or verbally abusive, and the mother is scared for her life. I mean, and these people are really, really in pain, and they're really suffering, and they don't know how to help their loved one. Like this mother is, you know, tried everything for her son and can't figure out how to help him. And so for me, I don't think that's a good place to be for the son or for the mother. And, you know, I hate to bring this up, but I'm going to bring it up, which is that there's been all these school shootings recently, and there's always this big talk of mental health immediately after one of these, you know, tragedies happens. And then you always find out that the person was exhibiting some kind of bizarre behavior, and everyone's like, well, why didn't they get help? And I'll tell you why, because it's really hard to get help for somebody who doesn't want to get help. And so I think if a person can function, if a person has, you know, a different way of thinking or is neurodivergent but can function in society, then all power to them. But if they're at the point where they can no longer function, where they're becoming, you know, a danger or to self or others, then something needs to happen, because otherwise tragedies do happen, and that's not the majority of cases, for sure, but it's something that I, as a family member, have always worried about, that my loved one is going to do something, and I'm always scared, you know, when I'm in a situation where my loved one is in a state of, you know, psychosis, and I'm scared for the child, I'm scared for the other people who are, you know, in the living situation. And so for me, I don't think it's a pleasant place to be. And so I think that if you can function and you speak so eloquently. Like, obviously, you're you can get by in the world and you're thriving. But for my family member, it wasn't the case. At one point, they were doing well and then they couldn't do anything. And so it's not a pleasant place to be sometimes.
Yeah, I think the options are extremely limited because of these different realities not being kind of understood on different levels. Like, I think in the US, it's like criminalization or institutionalization. I mean, it's just very like intense kind of way of approaching it. So I love how both of you are coming to this question from different points of view.
I just want to add that because if I'm not mistaken, a lot of the school shootings happened with people who are like low-key white supremacists.
High-key white supremacists.
Like, that's not a mental health neurodivergent thing. That's just a completely different thing. And this idea that ties neurodivergence to violence like that is, I think, deeply problematic. And I also think that there's a lot about no one's saying that to accept neurodivergence or to depathologize like what's happening in people's heads means that, oh, this is fun, don't do anything about it. I don't think anyone's saying that at all. And I think functionality is also not a useful measure. Actually, there are many high-functioning people who are neurodivergent, myself included, whose lives are constantly at risk, who it's harder to get help because you're functional. The measure of functionality as a thing that really should be a measure at all, I'm not sure is particularly useful. I think is also a function of a capitalistic society where a person's worth is measured by their function and their ability to perform in a neurotypical way. I understand the concerns of family members, but I think part of why I wrote Freshwater was to be like, in this book, Ada is extremely high functioning. I was extremely high functioning. I started college at 16 and got my first degree at 19 and was nearly dying the entire way. And no one knew what was happening inside. And so one of the things I wanted to do with Freshwater was to kind of walk people through, no, this is what's happening on the inside of the person, not as someone who's looking on. My mom read it and I was terrified that she was going to hate it. And she was just very grateful because she was like, because I wouldn't talk to her about a lot of the things.
She feel like she understood your experience more after reading it?
A little bit more.
Like she felt
was
closer to that experience that she was so confused by back?
She felt closer to me because she was like, oh, there were all these things that I kind of wondered about, but I didn't know, and now I kind of, get to see it. My sister doesn't like the book. She was like, this wasn't she's like, I like your other books. But
gotta have that one voice in your life that she just keeps
but
it
I think
real.
for her, it was a hard read. And I think for me, one of the things I wanted to do at Freshwater was just be like, a person is not their illness. No matter how much the ripple effects outside it are, that person is the one who's trapped inside with it and can't get away from it.
This is exactly this moment, these points of view, this simultaneity of points of view, I think is really important to hear. So thank you both for just laying bare your situation and reality. Seriously, I'm very emotional right now, but I'm going to hold it together and point the mic at you guys. This person right here with the glasses. Well, you both have glasses. That wasn't helpful at all. Sorry. You.
Thank you again so much for both of your novels and for this talk. And I had a question. I think this is for Akwaeke. And Freshwater, since you mentioned the spirituality of the novel and how it's less about mental illness, I was wondering, and also since in your author bio you mentioned liminal spaces and all of that, where you placed the novel in a post-colonial context, and if there were any Igbo texts that were sort of floating around in your mind while you were writing it. if any? And were you mindful of trying to translate it for a Western or US-based audience?
You actually just reminded me that there's a reading list that I have compiled and that I need to share, because multiple people have been like, we need to read like associated text with it, because I did a lot of research going into it, and it turns out that Igbo people, we really, really love to write about our culture. Like, really just love to talk about it. There are academic papers, there are textbooks. I found someone's master's thesis that is just about death rituals.
Amazing.
Of Igbo people. And I was like, I don't know when I would need this much information about death rituals, but I love it. There were forums online that were just Nigerians yelling at each other about cosmology. And I was like, oh, we're really, really invested in this, which is going to be interesting for me when the book comes out in Nigeria, because then everyone's going to come. And a few of the questions I've gotten have kind of been like, what gives you the authority to write from such a spiritual center, or to write and claim that this character is an Obanje or the child of a deity? I generally just refuse to answer that question. I growing up with a Tamil mother in Nigeria. There's this concept where if you're not full Nigerian, you're not really Nigerian. So I grew up with this whole thing of people being like, well, are you really? And all these questions about authenticity. So now I just don't play the game at all. I'm just like, no, I'm not like proving myself in that case. In having the book come out, I think I wanted to make it legible to a certain extent, not necessarily to a Western audience. There was a talk that Chinelo Parenta did once with another writer, Igoni Barrett, and they had faced, these things of like, oh, are you, kind of explaining your culture to the West? And she's like, and she pointed out a very pertinent thing, which was, there's 200 million people in Nigeria. There's 250 different ethnic groups and languages. And so she's like, why do you assume that if I'm explaining it's to the West? Why can't it be to other Nigerians or to other Africans or to other people of color around the world? What's wrong with making the work a little bit more legible to them? Like, even the act of assuming that this is for the West is like, that assumption is what centers whiteness, not necessarily even the work. But there was a lot I wanted to make it legible to myself and to a reader, because that's kind of what a book is supposed to be, is that the story is meant to be legible. But there was a lot of it that I really didn't. And I was lucky to have an editor who was very much on my side. My editor is interestingly half Malaysian as well. It looks like a regular white dude. Mom is Punjabi. And so when the copy editor came on, they were like, let's italicize all this stuff and let's do a glossary. And both of us were just like, absolutely not.
Thank you, editor.
We're not doing that.
Yeah.
And there was a moment near the end of Freshwater, there's this Igbo concept of chi that gets mentioned, and a chi is like your small god or personal god. And my editor had made a note, and he's like, that's like more of an Asian concept. Maybe you can explain it more. And I was like, no, it's not. It's the same word and just a completely different thing. And he apologized, and he was like, I should have Googled that before I came and asked you this. So I think it was a pretty positive experience in terms of being able to write a book that was very centered in this reality and in this spiritual world. And I did not think it was going to do well at all for that precise reason. And I was like, it's America. Who's going to want to read a book about Igbo ontology?
Everybody.
I think I underestimated a lot of people. I apologize.
Yeah. Well, people are, they do want to read books that make them feel and think in multiple levels, multitudes. I feel like both books really grasp this concept of we are multitudes, and plurality is also individuality. They're simultaneous. You know what I'm saying?
I like how that sounds. I was like, I'm going to write that down.
Okay, you had a question, and then somebody help me, because I don't know time-wise how we're doing. Like, I'm in the moment. 2 more questions? Okay. So, yes.
I'm going to stand because I can't see you, not because I want everybody to see me. So I want to thank you both for coming. I've read Mira's book. I haven't read your book yet, but so I'm a psychologist. So I had a lot of like reactions listening to the way people talked about psychology, psychiatry, the medical complex, many of which I actually agree with and such. But my concern was that there seems to be a romanticization, and I said I haven't read your book, and the writing was beautiful, but of what can be very dangerous pathologies, or what I would call a dangerous pathology. And I think, Mira, you're nodding your head that you see that. I work in a forensic unit. I work with people who have killed, who have raped, who have maimed others. I choose to work there. It certainly does temper my view of the world in many ways. But, you know, I reflect back to even before I was doing that, but one of my very first families that I ever worked with, the mom was diagnosed with DID, dissociative identity disorder, which was an overdiagnosed diagnosis at the time. This is the mid-'80s. And the son was a patient in an adolescent unit that I was working on. And the suspicion was that he had tried to kill his mother. And in a session, one of the mother's alters, the mother was DID, one of her alters admitted to having done it. The only witness to that admission was myself. And so this child was being put through this system that can be very punitive, that can be very harsh, because this mom who celebrated her, what you now call neurodivergence.
Do you have a question? Do you have a question?
I'm not sure that I do.
Okay.
I mean,
I feel like we want to hear your question about this.
All right. So my question is
because we can talk after, but this is about
right,
Q
yeah, I know,
and
I know.
A,
So
not
I'm trying to put
show
this
and
into
tell.
a question. So, do you think there is a point where there is this celebration of such typical reality, or neurotypicality, whatever you want to call it, that can endanger society? And where's the line?
Okay. I'll let you guys. I'm like, I have stuff to say, but Akwaeke, please.
I'm not sure. Again, this goes back to my earlier point where I'm like, the minute you even suggest that minute you suggest a different center, people's reaction is like, oh, you're celebrating it, you're romanticizing it. And I'm not sure where that's coming from. In Freshwater, one of the things that happened in a lot of the reviews was that people pointed out how brutal it was. They were like, there is so much trauma here. There's self-harm, there's this, there's that. And all of that is very, written about very openly. Esquire tries to kill Ada, makes several, her entire goal is to try and kill Ada for what she considers benevolent reasons. So I'm not sure where the romanticization, that's too many eyes. I'm not sure where that's coming from, or where the idea is that oh, it's celebrated. That is, I think,
in hearing what you read, it sounded to me like the character, that self, was celebrating herself.
What is, okay, I have to interject. Okay. So I think that we're getting into this interesting territory. We've been getting there with several questions, but I think that the idea that people who have atypical, neurodivergent ways of living in the world shouldn't find joy and moments of happiness and celebration in their being is absolutely not helpful for the conversation that we're having about these characters tonight. So that is really, I deeply feel that. So I don't know if you don't agree with me, we can talk about it more, but it's every single human being deserves to live a life of joy and fullness. And the way that we order that in a white supremacist capitalist patriarchy is not the same for every person and every body. So that's what I'm getting from reading your book. I mean, I got so many things from your book, but I definitely suggest you read the book to see how destroyed and how celebratory and how complex and multiple the experience is. It's not just one experience. And I think that is also in Mira's book too, where there is this deep pain and, there's a character who's struggling, but she's also a person that people find joy and has a joie de vivre and love and life and laughter, which could be her personality, But I think that these are coming at, a larger issue from different angles. So I don't think that celebrating is necessarily, I don't even know if that's the right word, but I think it's just more nuanced and complex than pathology,
I have a craft note. So I took a Toni Morrison seminar a while back, and we read like all her books. And we were in a little conference room.
All the books?
Like we took a semester, like we read a lot of it. And one of the other students there was upset about a character in the book who's a pedophile, because she was like, "Oh, this character is just shown the way that they are," and she was like, and the community is like very much like, "Okay, yeah, everyone knows that he likes little girls. Like, keep your kids away from him." But he's still a part of the community. And so the student was like, she was upset because the character was just shown. And she's like, "I don't know how I'm supposed to feel about this." And the professor who was teaching the seminar, she was like, well, yes. Like, that's what happens when a writer shows you a character and doesn't tell you how to feel about it. And then you have to figure out on your own how you want to feel about that. So the way that Freshwater is written, and this is really a craft thing, is that it is centered in the different characters. When they narrate from their center, not from an outside perspective that is imposing any kind of judgment or that is saying, well, I'm going to show you this and it's bad. But they're just being shown as is. And that is a deliberate choice, because that's what a center is that you show it as it was, and the reader gets to decide how they feel about it. But I, as the author, am not going to come and be like, Asugra felt this way and it was bad, kids, don't try it at home.
I agree very much with that. From a writerly perspective, is that when I was writing the book, my book is written from several different perspectives, but 4 main characters, and they all have a different view. They're kind of connected by Lucia, but they have the orbit around her. And I had no agenda in writing the book other than to explore each person's individuality and, their own, reaction and struggles with the decisions that they had to make given their situations. And I as an author, I don't like when, somebody has this agenda up here and they use their characters to try to further something like that. I always feel like I can sense it, and I don't like that. So when I was writing, it's funny because all this stuff only came up after I had finished the book, and then now we were starting to market the book that I had to start thinking of themes and what was I trying to say. And I'm like,
at the time, you're just telling a story. You're just showing it.
I wasn't trying to say anything about, the system or like...
Everything here is beautiful. Okay. That's what I'm trying to say.
I'm very character focused. I was deeply, deeply involved and had a lot of empathy. I just tried to put as much empathy as I could into each character, and that was what I was interested in. I was not interested in, sending a message or, putting some kind of telling you what to think about this person or this person's bad or this person's not. And I think that, as a writer, that's something that we are, now I am aware of, now that I've had to think about it. I feel like for the next book, I'm going to be like trying really hard not to think about these things that I never thought about for the first book, because I just wanted to tell a story. I was just, very much, from the heart trying to tell a story of these character struggles. And so I don't even remember what the original question was, but anyway.
We went all around the world on that one. All right, last question from the audience. Yes?
Hi. I've been to like 3 of her events. I'm so sorry. Akwaeke. So this question is for both of you, and it's kind of like, I guess, in contradiction to the statement/thesis question before. So both of the characters, the main characters of these books, Mira, I haven't read your book yet. Are people of color, people who come from backgrounds that have been like colonized. And so this is a question, it's just a lot of build up to it. So in navigating my own like personal mental health journey, and in the theme of intervention, like my mom is a scientist, but she's also like very spiritual, like a Christian person, but she comes from the Caribbean, so she knows, you know, about like other like African traditional beliefs. And there's always been this battle of, am I okay? Am I not okay? And if I'm not okay, how is my family going to deal with that? And how are they going to also deal with the intra-community aspect of, you know, you're always being surveyed, especially as a black person, like we know this. And then having the fact that there's also something wrong with you and you have to be watched like extra closely just to make sure that, like Mira, you were saying, well, I'm not that extreme, but like, you know, someone doesn't like hurt themselves, or they go to a place where they can't function anymore and stuff like that. So I guess my question is like, how did you, in your book, like address, or if you weren't thinking about it, reflecting now, like address the delicate dance of how to help someone and protect them from themselves at times, but also protect them from the harsh binary systems and, you know, criminalization systems of the world that already don't need an excuse to criminalize a body of color.
Oh, beautiful question. I love that question. Yeah, you did a great job with that question. Do you guys want to? This is a great final question. I think it encapsulates this very real heart of what we're talking about right now.
I think for me, in writing Freshwater, so much of my own life had been spent thinking about the community and the family with a capital F, and thinking about how my mental health was affecting them, and never really feeling like I could really focus on myself because I was so guilty, because everyone reminds you of how much it's affecting them, and how inconvenient it is for them, and how they think you're doing it for attention, and like 1,000 other things. And there was, and so I wanted to make work that was just pulled away from that whole reality. So a couple of people had read the book and they were like, oh, you know, they wanted to hear more from Ada. They wanted more of the narrative to be centered in her, but for me the point was to not do that. The point was to not center it in there, because so much of her world was defined by the community and by the family and by all the masks that she had to wear and all the ways she had to pretend to be okay or not be okay, or the ways that she'd been conditioned to be excellent to the point where she couldn't stop being excellent even when she was dying. And I've talked a little bit about how, in general, I think one of the things as a person of color, especially as an immigrant, is being told that you have to be high achieving, and that, you know, the whole family's riding on it, and so many people have sacrificed to get you here. And I think once on Twitter, I was like randomly talking about how like being trained, like literally trained and conditioned to be a high functioning, like good student and to acquire discipline and all these things is part of what like allows me to write books very fast. It's also part of what almost killed me several times, because I couldn't stop. And
Same energy that makes you brilliant in the process also makes it hard to just...
yeah, and there's so much, I think for me, that in that question, there's so much in the answer about, I don't know, about mass. Like there's several parts in the book where Asugara and Ada are interested in the idea that people can't see what's happening, even when it's shown to them. Like Ada starts cutting when she's 12. Her family never says anything about it, never notices, never. There are all these ways in which there's a mask that's kind of a sediment of, oh, community expectations, family expectations, immigrant family expectations, academic expectations. And behind there you have, like, in the book, you have like this little girl who's like terrified and breaking and trying to scream past that mask, and no one can see her and no one can hear her. And she's locked in this world. And I wanted to, I don't know if this is actually answering the question, but I wanted to show what that world was like and give it a bit of space and hope that, I think that so much of what is denied to bodies of color is space and just like air and being able to exist as is, to exist without all those things that are forcing a mask on you. And I hoped that the book would resonate with people who are like, oh, I didn't think that there was space to tell a story like this that was so interior, that was so like self-centered on an almost obsessive way, where it's just like, oh no, because there's so much happening there. And just to claim that space and be like, oh, this is not a story about like Ada and her family. Like they can come in bits, but at the end of the day, this is about her and herself and this part of her that has been denied space in every other like context she's been in, and being able to like claim that space and just tell the story of that.
That's interesting that you say there's so much of the community kind of squeezing her in. In my book, it actually is almost the opposite of that, in that the sisters come over with only their mother, and for various reasons, they've basically cut family ties. So they're basically alone in this country when they arrive, and so there actually isn't any family expectation or at all, but instead they're just very alone. And this is something that shapes Lucia in that she's always searching for that bigger community. It's something she really wants. And so part of the reason I think that she gets involved with the men that she gets involved with is because they do come from these kind of big, chaotic families that have lots going on, and she's drawn to that. So in a way, it's like she's searching for that because she didn't have it as a child.
Well, thank you all for being here. Buy their books because they're so good, and they're in the back, and the real life author can sign it for you. So yeah, have a great night, and
Thank you all so much.
Thank you.